Hello, I'm Lily Hyam.
And I'm Gordon Johnston. Welcome to the Last Question podcast, brought to you by Data Lab, Scotland's innovation centre for data and AI, hosted by the University of Edinburgh. And as always, if you're enjoying The Last Question, please do leave us a review and a rating on whatever platform you happen to be listening to the podcast on. It helps shuffle us up all the algorithms, and it really does mean a lot to us. We've also seen a big spike in listeners recently, so hello to all the new people out there. Hello.
Hello.
That's staying in, because that's what you can expect.
Today we're going to be chatting to Olga Tokariuk, a journalist, disinformation researcher and non-resident fellow of the Centre for European Policy Analysis. Olga's writing has been featured in Time, The Washington Post, The Daily Beast, NPR, BBC and many more places.
We're also very excited that Olga is going to be speaking at Data Summit 2023, which we're really, really looking forward to. She's going to be talking about disinformation and elaborating on some of the things we talk about today. Towards the end of the episode, there's going to be a code for 25% off your tickets to this year's Data Summit event in Edinburgh. So please do keep an ear out for that after the interview.
So to kick things off, let's start with a definition. Quite often you will see the terms disinformation and misinformation used interchangeably, but there is a very important distinction to be made between them. Disinformation is the deliberate spreading of false information with the intent to deceive. Misinformation is the spreading of false information unintentionally.
Yeah, but as we'll be discussing today with Olga, in practice it's not always so clear-cut. There's a huge amount of grey area between misinformation, disinformation, propaganda, spin, weaponized ignorance. It's almost impossible to tell where one ends and the next begins.
And they can influence each other as well. So Absolutely. I might accidentally spread misinformation because I believe something to be true based on some disinformation that seemed convincing that someone said to me. And on the other end of that, it could be that I just make a mistake and I have misunderstood something and I say something and then someone takes what I've said and uses that as disinformation. So you can have a chain where you have disinformation and misinformation alternating and feeding off each other. Disinformation in one form or another has been around for a really, really long time, but in terms of how we talk about it today, it has its origins around 100 years ago in the Russian State Political Directorate, which is a precursor to the KGB. They would use black propaganda, which is a political material designed to look like it comes from a particular group in order to discredit that group.
Yeah, so it would be, if you write something pretending to be somebody else and you're being like wildly racist in it, that would be black propaganda. So, something that comes up a lot in our recent podcast is the idea of truth and how in any capacity it's really becoming more and more difficult to discern what that actually means. So I found this quote from Patrick Warren, who is the head of Clemson's Forensic Media Hub, to be really, really interesting. He said, quote, "You don't actually have to convince someone that it's true. It's sufficient to make people uncertain as to what they should trust." And I think that really, really gets to the heart of the problem with disinformation.
Yeah, it's not just about getting a particular point across surreptitiously, it's about undermining all sources of information.
So today we're going to be talking to Olga about all of this and more. We're really, really excited for this interview. It's going to be a lot of fun. So thanks so much for joining us, Olga. You've had a long and distinguished career in journalism and disinformation research. Can you tell us a little bit about how you've seen the nature of the news cycle and reporting and disinformation in particular change since you first started your career?
Well, I'm not sure about distinguished, but yeah, maybe long career, at least in journalism since mid-2000s. I worked mostly on TV, and when I just started working, of course, well, there was already internet, but social media were not yet a thing. And that was a very different information environment, as you can imagine. So people mostly took their news and they mostly got to know the news from the mainstream media. So they still read newspapers, they still watch TV. And that, of course, is very different now when for many people, the major source of news are social media. Then the news cycle, of course, was much slower. So now something that was relevant in the morning might be obsolete by the evening. And then the next day, it's a completely not a thing. It was very different in mid-2000s. the media organizations, I would say, in mid-2000s, they relied more heavily on presence of their correspondents on the ground, as those were very often people who knew most, who knew more than the editor sitting in the office would, which is not the case now. So very often now it's the opposite. The opposite is the case. A person who is on the ground will be contacted by an editor and told the latest news and told, all the context. And then the editor will ask a person on the ground, the reporter on the ground, to go and check and verify and, cover the story based on the information they already have. There is still, of course, value to reporting from the ground, to being on the ground, because it's the most immediate way to establish a connection with people on the ground and see, the situation with journalists' own eyes. But I would say that the information space is so saturated now that there is no reliance, or the reliance on reporters on the ground is not as heavy as it used to be.
It's funny that the kind of citizen journalism thing felt quite important for a little while, especially in the kind of late 2010s and everything. And then there were so many revolutions happening around the world that are being kind of propagated and pushed forward by encrypted messaging and whatnot. It felt like we were on the cusp of this big revolution in the way that news was going to be shared around the world. But then AI popped up and generative AI popped up, and now it's all just kind of gone to hell again. It's very difficult to know what's real and what isn't, but we're going to get onto that in another part of the podcast.
I think citizen, did you call it citizen? Journalism. Like citizen science can be good in some areas that are less, people have less reason to twist the truth. So citizen science, for example, when people are noting down what birds species are in different areas, you're probably not going to get people making up what kind of birds they see in different areas as often. And that in that way, it's really good because you're just getting loads and loads of information from people in lots of different areas that you probably can trust quite well. People will still make mistakes. But when it comes to something that people have an agenda about, or something they really want to be true, when emotions come into play with fear, then it changes the reliability of that data. And even if they mean to be truthful, they have things that will affect their perceptions a lot more than just looking for a robin in your back garden.
Well, and speaking of citizen journalism, I remember that, almost euphoric at times when social media just appeared, and that coincided almost in time with the Arab Spring revolutions. And you remember that euphoria about how it was possible, thanks to social media, for people to mobilize, to connect, to unite, to go down to protest. And that was stretched in time. And that also happened in Ukraine with the Revolution of Dignity in 2013, that started basically out of a Facebook post of one of Ukrainian journalists, Mustafa Nayem, who, in reaction to the decision of the then president, Yanukovych, pro-Russian president, to not to sign a political association agreement with the European Union. So there was a reaction from this journalist who wrote a post on his Facebook. He wrote, "So let's gather at this place in downtown Kyiv, Maidan, Independence Square, take your tea and see you there." And that's how it started. I remember seeing that post and I remember reacting to it. I remember going to that square. And that was the time when the social media were still perceived as something, inherently good, as a way to connect people, to make them mobilize, to make social change possible, especially in authoritarian regimes. It is still the case, partially, citizen journalism and social media in some most restrictive environments in the world, like Myanmar, for example, or occupied Crimea, Russian-occupied Crimea in Ukraine. They are still a thing. Well, of course, social media are much more controlled by the governments now. So the governments in authoritarian countries, they learned to monitor, to detect, to, censor social media. We're not even touching the subject of the Great Chinese Firewall here. But the fact that I think that also at some point in time, the citizen journalism and social media, they separated, they took separate parts, they took separate paths. So now citizen journalists, they have other tools to do what they do. And I think it is still a thing. Citizen journalism is still a thing in many places of the world that where free media do not exist, where the government restrict access to information, where they imprison journalists and persecute, free speech and dissidents. So yeah, occupied Crimea is one of them. Occupied territories of Ukraine since the Russian full-scale invasion is another example.
There are a lot of powers and positive things about citizen journalism in that way as well. Yeah, it shouldn't just be particular voices that are allowed to talk to everyone. Speaking of Ukraine, one of the biggest geopolitical events in recent history has been Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Russia, as I'm sure everyone listening knows, has a long history of propaganda and disinformation campaigns in the modern era, dating back to the State Political Directorate, which was a precursor to the KGB. Could you tell us a bit about the use of disinformation in the current political climate, in particular around the invasion of Ukraine?
Yeah, well, as you correctly say, that active measures were used by the USSR as a part of the Cold War playbook against the West. So information warfare, so-called hybrid warfare, is a part of Russia's foreign policy. Basically, Russia uses disinformation as a state-funded tool to achieve its foreign policy goals and also to achieve its military goals. Just before the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine, I've been working on the information research project with a company called Mythos Labs, and we analyzed narratives about Ukraine on Twitter using a combination of artificial intelligence and human intelligence. And we established a correlation between a spike in a number of tweets spreading disinformation about Ukraine and the Russian military movements on the Ukrainian border. So Russian military activity on the Ukrainian border first in 2021, in spring of 2021, and then the actual invasion in February 2022 were preceded by a spike of activity on social media, of, malign actors, inauthentic, suspicious accounts spreading disinformation about Ukraine. So these two, for Russia, conventional warfare and so-called hybrid warfare, the informational warfare, they go hand in hand. And Ukraine is just the most recent and most obvious example. Although I think that for many in beyond, this region, Eastern Europe, beyond Ukraine, or the Baltic states or Poland, it was something new. It was news. This was not something entirely expected. So people tended to believe that disinformation is something doesn't really affect our lives. It is not something that, has a direct impact on our lives. While I think Ukrainians, at least since 2014, they have experienced the opposite, that disinformation can literally kill. Because first on Russian TV, they were, the presenters of the TV shows, they were talking about the need to, wipe Ukraine out of the map or execute Ukrainians because they are Nazis. So they've been talking about that since 2014 on Russian television. And then they actually started implementing it in real life since 2022. So disinformation can kill. People who are engaged in spreading disinformation, propaganda, in many cases can be treated as war criminals and should be taken to account because they incite hatred, they can incite genocide. That's what's happening in Ukraine, but also in the West. So Russians are not just targeting audiences in Ukraine, they're not just targeting audiences in Russia, they're also targeting audiences in the West and also beyond, in the countries of the so-called global South. The intent there is different. The intent, obviously, is not as much to convince people to support Russia or what Russia is doing in Ukraine, but very often the intention in the West is to undermine support to Ukraine, and in other countries is to, but also in the West, but maybe more so in the global South, to kind of question, what is actually happening in Ukraine, to kind of get this message across that we will never know the truth, that maybe, the Bucha massacre never happened, that maybe Ukrainians are killing themselves, that maybe, this is actually the war that not Ukrainians are fighting, not Ukrainians are resisting, but Ukrainians are just pawns in this proxy war between the West and Russia. So there are different different tactics and different tools that Russia uses. Disinformation, it targets it to very specific audiences. It's also, it's very often the narratives are very hyper local, so they would be different depending on the public that they are aimed for. Even within the same country, they could be different depending on, I don't know, in the US, whether they want to target the Democrat voters or the Republican voters. The messages would be different, and very often, this narratives, they play local grievances. So they would, in some countries that accepted large number of Ukrainian refugees, for example, they would try to foment this kind of feeling of fatigue and dissatisfaction with Ukrainian refugees. They would try to plant a narrative that accepting and helping Ukrainian refugees draws away the resources from the local population. So it would very much look at the context in different countries and try to play on it. And the goal would be not as much to convince people to believe in something, but to make them question everything, to make them not believe in anything, to make them disillusioned, especially in democracies, disillusioned with democracy itself, with the free speech itself, and in this way also to promote the civic inaction and the civic kind of disengagement of the population, so that the people say, well, it's so complicated, we will never know the truth, so I shouldn't be doing anything. I'm not taking sides in it. I'm not supporting either of the sides, so I will just disengage. I will just care about my own small things in my life, but I will not participate in any civic activity. I will not be active in my local community. I will not engage in with the government. So that's very often the goal. And I think Russian government really succeeded in doing so with the local population inside Russia, which seems to be very disenfranchised and very disillusioned, very cynical, very disengaged from any form of civic participation.
Yeah, I definitely think that kind of that fatigue and that sense that nothing you do really matters is definitely plaguing pretty much every major democracy in the world. You just have to look at the voter turnout figures, and it's shockingly poor. Especially in the UK for anything to do, back when we were in the EU election turnouts were woefully small. And I think Scotland's probably a little bit more politically engaged than some, but that's only because we've had a recent history of lots of political turmoil, albeit, peaceful political turmoil.
I think if people in democratic countries were more aware that there is actually a campaign going on behalf of authoritarian regimes, the information influence campaign, to make them disengaged, to actually encourage this type of thinking, if they were more aware of this, maybe they would be, more active, kind of treating it as an issue, as a challenge, as a threat. I think is a first step to act in this direction. I think this kind of wishful thinking that, this is something really theoretical, disinformation, information influence, malign influence campaigns, it doesn't concern us. It does not concern me as an individual. This is a mindset that should change, there should be more awareness that actually it can impact everyone's life. And I'm saying that because, obviously I'm a Ukrainian, I experience disinformation, I'm a target of disinformation on my social media, and as a Ukrainian, as a part of this group, I'm a target also of a lot of hate speech and genocidal rhetoric. But I experienced it as a journalist also, when I started to cover a story back in 2007 of a Ukrainian soldier who was prosecuted for murder in Italy, murder of an Italian photographer who was killed in Ukraine in 2014 on a territory which was contested between Ukrainian forces and Russian proxy forces. So that person was prosecuted and accused of deliberate murder of this Italian photo reporter based on circumstantial evidence, and as a part of the evidence were a lot of open source articles, and some of them were coming from websites such as RT or Russian Spring. So Italian prosecution thought that they can trust these sources, and that was already like a big kind of red flag for me, because I was like, how can anyone trust RT as a legitimate media outlet? But many people still do. Many people in the world still do. While in Europe, there is awareness and there have been sanctions, and RT has been taken down from social media, from TV networks, from satellite. But it's not the case in Latin America. It's not the case in Africa. It's not the case in Asia. It's not the case even in Serbia, in Europe, where it is expanding. So, a long story short, that story of a Ukrainian soldier that I covered for 4 years, and that eventually ended with his complete exoneration. Yeah. So he was sentenced in the first grade for murder. He was found guilty. He was sentenced to 24 years in prison. And then there was an outcry. There was a lot of coverage because the first trial didn't get a lot of coverage in the press. And then there was much more coverage of the appeals and the cassation, the Supreme Court trials. And more details were shed. And I also, as an investigative journalist with a group of my colleagues, so we talked a lot about this case, and we added, I think, to this kind of debate and trying to attract the attention to this case. So he was eventually exonerated of all charges. But even the fact that such a trial had taken place in a EU member state, in a country which is a democracy, which has a rule of law. New York Times wrote an article about this case. So this was something that was noticed, and kind of the tone of the article was like, how is it possible that disinformation and penetrates even the courtrooms? How is it possible that a democratic country, an EU member, the legislative branch in a country that is an EU member, can take RT as a legitimate source, and an article from RT as a piece of evidence in court? How is that even possible? And for me, it's just an illustration that there is not enough awareness, that a lot of people still think it's not an issue, and that Russian state-controlled media are just another point of view, or just like the US or any other media in a democratic country, which is completely not the case.
So one thing I've always been really curious about, because I studied politics and sociology, then I did a master's in PR. I've always been really curious about where to draw the line between disinformation, misinformation, and propaganda. I'm thinking in particular of the kind of state of political discourse we have right now, especially in countries like the US and the UK, where you have, very prominent people like Tucker Carlson, who states unequivocally on television that the US election was stolen. But then months later, we find out from all his leaked text messages that he never believed that at all. So that would be disinformation in its purest form, because its intent was to maliciously misinform. But the way that he pushes his opinions forward, it's always in that quote unquote, I'm just asking questions discourse, the thing that's always a get out of jail free card. You can say anything you want as long as you say, I'm just asking,
There's never just asking a question.
No, you're never just asking a question. So that means you could argue that it's misinformation. If he is just asking these questions that are not deliberately meant to mislead, it's just, ignorance. But then it's funny that they always follow these like really highly partisan talking points, and they are designed to sway opinion, which feels a lot more like propaganda. So I guess I'm wondering, how do we categorize and tackle disinformation in a world when disinformation, misinformation, and propaganda are so like closely entwined?
Yeah, well, it's a very difficult question, and I have no answer. I think that very often it's even really difficult to draw a line between the three. As you said, that disinformation, something that was a misinformation initially, which means there was no intent to misinform people, to feed them incorrect, false information, can be then used and abused by actors who intentionally want to feed people false information. So they can just, use a post by someone who, with no intention, misinformed their audience about something, but that can be then shared and amplified by someone who has the intention to misinform. And if we're talking about propaganda, especially by state actors, that's then again, they're using all the available tools, and very often they're happy. Again, of course, I'm keeping in mind Russia when I'm talking about that. They're very happy when there are people in other countries who would, maybe non-intentionally, but they would spread messages and information and ask questions that are really favorable and to the Kremlin, that somehow echo Russian talking points and echo Russian narratives, because that would serve then for Russian propaganda as a way to legitimize their narrative in the eyes of their own population. Because then on the Russian state-controlled media, you would see an article which says, look, this journalist in Germany is writing about this and that. So that means that the German public, they support Russia. They are, they believe what we are saying. So they are on our side. Even if that person in Germany is some like marginal blogger who does not have an audience. But it is enough that this person is a foreigner, and that foreigner is very often would start from questioning the actions of their own government or criticize the West, the EU, the US, whatever, NATO, you name it. But then it would be twisted and manipulated by Russian media, by Russian propaganda media to feed it to their own audience and to say, look, these people support us. They are on our side because they are asking this question. So it's very difficult to draw a line between misinformation, disinformation, and propaganda these days. I think it's even impossible to draw the line. What we can do is to be aware of how these actors operate. Because of course, misinformation can be harmful, but this is something that, we can do little about. Like, I think we've all done it. We've all shared something which we thought was true, and then it turned out that it was false, but we didn't have any intention to do harm or to, mislead people. So you can do little with misinformation, but you can do more with disinformation. You can, raise awareness. You can speak about those actors who are engaging in this intentional disinformation campaigns. You can take action to counter these actors. You can, talk to the public, raise their media literacy, and of course, if we're talking about journalism and journalists, of course, journalists need to be aware of how disinformation operates. It is not freedom of speech when two opinions, one of which is based in fact and the other one isn't, are equalized, are put on the same footing, which often happens in journalism because, we care about freedom of speech. We want to give space to different opinions, but then we should also be careful. Are these opinions based in fact? Are the sides that we are platforming, do they have arguments to support their opinion? Because not all opinions are equal. And if we do not care about this, whether they have arguments to support their opinion, then we might be also unintentionally spreading disinformation. We might be facilitating the access to people who have an intention to spread disinformation by giving them the platform, by giving them the floor, by giving them the ability to reach wider audience than they would otherwise.
Especially if you might have a debate between two people, one of which has a lot of evidence for their point of view, but the other is perhaps more charismatic but doesn't have evidence, and then they could just sway the opinion through their charisma.
Absolutely, via emotions. So yeah, it's like one of the first rules also when talking to people, like how to kind of distinguish disinformation. Just like stop and think before you want to share something that evokes really strong emotions in you. Just like stop and think and like take a break and think like, who is the source? What could be the intention? Can I verify it? Can I find corroboration of this information in other sources? Because the emotions, people are easy to manipulate because of the emotions, and very often the disinformation actors, they would use that.
I think media literacy that you mentioned is going to be so important. It's already important. It's been important for decades, but I think it's going to become critical now that we teach young people how to properly analyze information that they receive from any source. It's not that we should foster like a sense of distrust in them. I'm not saying you shouldn't trust anything, but at the same time, maybe they shouldn't. Maybe we should critically analyze every single thing that we encounter. Media literacy is going to be absolutely critical.
In Finland, for example, they are doing it from primary school, and Finland is one of the best countries in terms of, media literacy of its population, critical thinking, ability to distinguish false information. It's not, of course, it's not a silver bullet. It does not guarantee that there won't be people who will not, buy it, who will not be disinformed. But still, it helps. I think it helps. So we should all learn from Finns.
I think the other thing you mentioned about not all opinions are equal, that's really important as well. I think that's something we've all lost sight of. Social media has been this incredible kind of democratizing force where a lot of regular people have found that their voices are being amplified to hundreds of thousands or millions of people with their posts. We have this influencer culture, but that doesn't mean that their opinion is equal to somebody who has expert knowledge of a subject. It's like you wouldn't put a NASA scientist on the same, panel as a flat earther because one of them's based in science and, experimental research and the other one isn't. So I think we've kind of, as a sort of Western culture, I think we've kind of adopted this idea that all opinions are equal and everybody should have a voice and everyone should have the right to, free speech and to say what they want. But that doesn't mean that we should listen to everybody. I've got lots of opinions and most of them are complete garbage and I should not be listened to in any regard, but I should be allowed to, to voice them. It's why I've got 17 Twitter followers and it's going down by the day.
Unless, it's not harming anyone and you are posting it in some your private space and there is around you, there is no someone who actually wants to kind of exploit and abuse you to advance their agenda, then it's fine. But I monitor not just Ukrainian information space, but I also monitor Italian information space. I speak Italian language. And since the start of Russian full-scale invasion, what happened very often on Italian talk shows especially, so not, news or political analysis programs, but mostly talk shows that cover all sorts of topics, not just politics, not just international events. They would often have exactly, what you said. They would have a person who has an expert knowledge in the region, like in Ukraine, Russia, in, conflict studies. And then they would have a blogger who just has strong opinions. And these people will be given equal screen time. And then the audience will be asked to rate, whose opinion they liked more. So it's completely insane. I mean, in the current media also environment, when the media are in crisis, media don't have money anymore. Traditional mainstream media are, their advertising revenues are falling. They are really struggling to compete with social media, with, the influencers and bloggers. They don't have resources that they used to have. Very often it's a struggle of who is the loudest, who does the most clickbait, if it's, online media or if it's TV, who just attracts the audience by making, the coverage as emotional as possible so that just people are hooked on this needle of emotion. So I somewhere still, of course, the UK has its problems, and, as you mentioned earlier, but I still think that in a way, from the UK perspective, you're not looking at the media environment in other countries, even in continental Europe. It might still seem that, things are not that bad. But if you take a closer look on what's happening, like in countries where media are in a worse situation, where they have less resources, where there is not this also strong kind of public oversight over public broadcasters, and where private media are in hands of very rich people who don't really care about the quality of journalism and fact-checking, but they care about revenues, they care about shares and ratings and how many people watch their content. The situation is very, very different.
I think the UK is definitely very lucky that we've got some exceptionally high quality media outlets that are still operating. I mean, they're struggling, but they're getting by. I do think we've got one of the worst tabloid press cultures in the world. I mean, the tabloid press has like literally killed people here. But that's a niche thing. It's hard to even see that as being part of the news culture. That's more, I don't know, entertainment, I guess, for lack of a better word. And I really feel like I'm lacking a better word there. Because you can't swear on the podcast. I need to ask my bosses if I can swear on this.
Yes.
I'm going to hazard a guess and say no.
It might make it more entertaining, and then more people would listen to it. But I think entertainment is the right word to use, because it's actually what we've been speaking about, right? It's like entertainment would draw more people, and even if it's not entertainment in a joyful way, if it's entertainment in a way that like it really grabs your mind because it elicits strong emotions in you. So.
And nothing against entertainment, but very often like it's just done for the sake of entertainment. And if the topics are more complex than just like a wedding party of a celebrity, and there is not decent fact checking, then it can get really nasty.
If only the harsh truth could be more entertaining, but sometimes they just don't combine entertainment and harsh truth. Speaking of media literacy and the difficulty of personally pulling apart what you see to know what to believe or not, generative AI is changing the nature of discourse and content online at a staggering rate. You've got almost photorealistic images being shared and absorbed uncritically, deep faked audio and video that's very realistic, and all of which is happening at a really fast pace. It's like that old idiom, a lie is halfway around the world while the truth is getting its boots on. We've had instantaneous communication for a while now, and rapid news cycles for even longer, but now we can have false or misleading stories with matching audio and video content spread across vast networks in a heartbeat. How do you think AI is going to affect politics in the future, and how might we harness it for good? You can answer those two parts separately if you like, because both are very big questions.
Well, definitely the AI is facilitating the work of disinformation actors largely. So I'm not sure that, Russians will have to fund a troll farm in somewhere near St. Petersburg and to continue paying salaries to trolls, to people who are sitting there, writing the same comments on social media and, tweeting from their sock puppet accounts to spread certain narratives anymore, because the AI can do it. More and more, this process become automated. They become cheaper. They become easier, and that really facilitates the life of those malign actors that are treating disinformation just as as a tool, as a part of the system of how they operate. The example of Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Russia, for example, they've produced deep fake videos with President Zelensky, who in that fake video was announcing Ukraine's surrender, who was telling the soldiers to, return to their positions, to lay down their weapons. It emerged very early in the war, and it was completely, had very little credibility. It looked like it was obvious that this was a fake, also because of how Ukrainians resisted, how Ukrainian president took this very firm position that Ukraine will be fighting, that he's not leaving the country, that he's staying. He's asking for weapons, not to rights, he famously said. But they tried, like Russians tried, and they keep trying. And I'm sure they will keep trying. They will keep trying to use an AI for their goals. And what can we do? Like, what can people who are optimistic or want to be optimistic about the AI do? I think, well, we should look at the opportunities, how to make AI work for good. And I've mentioned already a project that I worked on where the AI was helpful to identify the networks of inauthentic, suspicious accounts on Twitter. So an algorithm was helping us with that. I know that a lot of my colleagues who also do disinformation research, they rely on AI to analyze big sets of data, big sets of narratives, messages, a lot of social media posts. So it can be helpful. It can be useful. I think we are now at this crossroads in a way, at this junction, and very soon it will become clear whether AI is a force for good when it comes to disinformation, or whether AI is a force for bad actors. So whether we can develop mechanisms and also maybe some regulation to use AI as a tool to counter disinformation, or with our lack of action, we will allow bad actors to use AI for their own purposes.
So race against the AIs for doing one thing on one side and another thing on the other side, like the deep fakes getting better and better, generative AI is getting better and better, and on the other side, the AIs designed to detect AI-generated images and videos and audio are getting better and better as well. So it's just like both of them are in a race.
Yeah, and now AI, it is discussed that the AI would be used to help identify images generated by AI. So it's like,
Yeah, it was something that I was thinking about a lot with this how to analyze images when I was reading about this topic, because scrolling through examples of disinformation use, the images come up a lot, images put in incorrect contexts, videos generated as well. But not only that, but things that are actually genuine that people want to say are fake because it goes against what they want to be put out. So it's like, not only would we generate images and video that are fake to get across a particular piece of information, we would also use the disinformation of something being fake to get across what we want to show. So then it all comes down to, like, can we, as individuals trying to find out what the truth is, analyze an image or a video and come to a conclusion whether it's fake or not? And there are lots of tools that people can use. I think even today I was looking at, there's a Google Chrome extension you can use. Yeah. There's different software you can use to do image analysis. And if you're bombarded with loads of these, then you would probably need an AI to automate doing all of that. But until then, I wonder if not only media literacy is something we need to be trained in, but also just the use of tools for individuals to be able to find out if an image is real or not.
I mean, we've spoken about this before, but it's the erosion of confidence in what the truth is that's a real problem with AI. You know, it's the kind of mundane things. Like the other day I listened to audio Joe Biden rapping "Forgot About Dre," and I was like relatively sure that didn't happen because his flow was immaculate, and I just don't think that Joe Biden has like the wherewithal to do that. So I knew that was fake. But if somebody had faked an audio of Joe Biden, I don't know, saying something iffy about abortion or talking about trains or something, I would absolutely have just believed that was true because it's staggeringly close to real life. Or, you know, to being really accurate.
The subtle things can be more effective.
Yeah, it's not going to be, you know, pictures of Trump tearing his top off and having a six-pack and like having a gun in both hands and storming the Capitol. It's going to be very, very, very subtle things.
The Pope jacket.
Yeah, I think we are going to see a lot of the examples of AI use in the upcoming election campaign in the US. So this should be probably the first election when all sides will use AI to manipulate the voters. And I feel uneasy about it. I don't know about you.
It's one of those things. It's hard to condemn the use of AI in situations where I don't like it and then completely accept it in situations where I do.
I think that's fine. It's a tool, and tools can be used in bad ways and good ways. You can use a knife to cut an onion, or can use it to cut a person.
Yeah, but what I meant was we don't condemn knives.
And this could be the same with some forms of AI.
Yeah.
Depends what you use it for. I suppose you could say that the way the AI has been built makes it a poor tool.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's something that the Data Lab is doing a lot of work in. And it's Scotland's AI strategy is to develop an AI culture that is trustworthy, ethical, and inclusive. Because if you build your AIs on inferior data that is only generated by, I don't know, a small percentage of the population, you're going to end up with a bad AI. That's always going to be the case. So again, can you imagine if there was an AI that was trained to find disinformation, but all you did was train it on, say, Daily Mail articles or Russia Today articles or other kind of right-wing news outlets? You get a wildly skewed idea of what disinformation is. Similarly, if you only did it in left-wing publications, it will be wildly skewed. That's why the kind of transparency and the ethics behind AI development is so vital.
As a journalist, have you or anyone you work with use any kind of digital forensics to work out whether the things that you're using as evidence have a good source to them?
Yeah, I'm using OSINT tools in my work to verify images, to geolocate, and to find data in open sources. So I found that the skills really make me as a journalist more competent. There is still a lot to learn, but I feel like journalists, they have to keep up with technology. They have to use, at least, be familiar with, they might not use them on their daily work, every day, but at least be familiar with these tools. It's really helpful. So AI is something that I'm just starting to use. So I'm not a proficient user yet. But I believe that the media community cannot just ignore the risks and opportunities, the challenges and opportunities that AI creates. And I really like to kind of walk in these two shoes in a way to, continue doing journalism, but also looking into disinformation and how to counter it, and also what's the role of the AI in it.
I noticed in your bio that you said you've been conducting research into using humor to combat disinformation. Could you tell us a little bit about how that works?
Yeah. So this was a project for the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism in Oxford. And I looked at how Ukraine, in particular, Ukrainian actors, both state actors, but also the media and just social media users, they used humor and memes to communicate strategically about Ukraine's resistance and Ukraine's, fight against Russian invasion, but also to combat Russian disinformation. You probably remember the meme with the Snake Island bodyguard who told the Russian warship to go and, get lost, if we are not using swear words on this podcast.
Apparently not.
So that became a meme. That was a true story that has been converted into a meme. Then the postal stamps were printed with it, envelopes, a lot of magnets, a lot of souvenirs. So, and this was something that really, I think, turned the tide of how the war was covered in the media and on social media by people from all over the world, because I think this was like this very symbolic act of resistance, of defiance, and of also using humor and irony in a very tragic situation of your country being under attack, loss of life, bombardments, missile attacks. But it turned out that even in this situation, you can still use humor, and it can be a useful tool to not just to cope with the tragedy, not just to cope with the loss, with destruction, with grief, but also it can be a useful tool to communicate Ukraine's cause, to build relationship with people from other countries using the same cultural codes, like references to popular movies like Star Wars or others, or so in this way, kind of mobilizing support for Ukraine, connecting with public, especially in the Western countries, because of this shared kind of cultural references, very often based in humor, like Simpsons or the Russia, USSR, a rotating table, the UN desk in one of the Simpsons episodes. So all these like very, very famous, familiar memes that could make this connection, and kind of so that Ukrainians were perceived as a part of us, a part of this wider democratic world. They are fighting our fight. Their cause is our cause, so we should support them. So I think Ukrainians were really smart in using humor to connect with, not just like on the government level, with the governments, but also at the people-to-people, person-to-person level with just members of public in other countries. Humor was also a good tool to combat disinformation, because when Russian official accounts on social media would post something like accuse Ukrainians of being Nazis or whatever, any sort of the crazy narrative that they produced, there would be Ukrainian either official accounts on social media or just Ukrainian users who would just like take that Russian tweet or whatever it was and just like ridicule and mock and create kind of a counter narrative and just like expose the absurdity of it. So very often a good strategy to approach disinformation and to counter disinformation is not just to debunk it. It's not enough to debunk it. It's been confirmed by many studies that only a fraction of people who saw a fake news, they would read the debunking. So it will stick with them, that like something they read first. So maybe 10% of people who read the fake news, they will read the debunking. And in this sense, like not just doing the debunking, not just exposing the fake news, but ridiculing the fake news, exposing the absurdity of a narrative is something that could work, because it could help to reach wider audience. It could help to reach people who are not necessarily interested in global news, in war in Ukraine, in whatever happens outside of their bubble. But they can relate to meme, they can relate to a good joke, they can relate to irony, they can relate to sarcasm, and then and that can be that connection. Then will somehow kind of allow them to sympathize with Ukrainians more. So yeah,
it's incredible that we might be on the cusp of like the war that memes won. That's a really, really fascinating world we live in. Terrifying, but fascinating. I'm glad the Simpsons memes are still being used. And it's that bit you mentioned with like the USSR, the Russia thing turning into USSR. I saw that so much at the beginning of the invasion. It was, my Twitter feed was full of it, mostly because it's like mostly Simpsons fans that are on there. Same with the Lenin thing when he's embalmed and he like punches through his glass coffin and says "must destroy capitalism." That's another great. I use that quite often when I have to go into work early, but that's just me complaining.
I really like that we can share like a humor of absurdity across.
Yeah, I mean it's like a sort of gallows humor. There's loads of examples of that. Like in World War II, like there's lots of like really, really bleak, dry British humor and graffiti and stuff that people were like, mocking like you said, the narratives that, the Nazis were trying to push. Because you're right, I think it's kind of like, it's the same with horror films. The line between horror and comedy is so fine. It's the same in kind of real life narratives. You can take something absolutely horrific and ridicule it in a way that takes away all of its power. And it's a really, really important tool.
And in a way, it's coming back to the entertainment thing again. It's like, it's something that you can connect with, that's like engaging to your mind, perhaps more than the debunking article for the disinformation, because it just draws you because it's entertaining, it's funny. And
yeah, what are people going to retweet? A dry article debunking some technical points, or a Simpsons meme?
Yeah, absolutely. And Ukraine has been like really good with using humor. So there is this official Twitter account of Ukraine that has been active for I don't know, at least 5 years, and they've produced some like really memorable memes, and they are really beating Russia on it. So this is something that started before the full-scale invasion. There was already this kind of, I wouldn't call it a tradition, but there were people who knew that this was the way, and who kind of were able to produce humorous content, and who were able to persuade also the government that this is something that they should do, because this is obviously state-affiliated official account, but also because Ukraine is a democracy, because the civil society is so strong. It was not a centralized effort, because it can never be funny if it's only coming from the government. Like, the government can't produce funny things. You probably remember in the US, they tried to counter Russian disinformation, and they spent like huge amount of money on creating a meme with a bear, which was like completely ridiculous, not funny at all. It was like terrible. So the thing is that in Ukraine, these people who, even like if they were running this kind of government state account of Ukraine, official account of Ukraine, they were not all of them were working in the government. So like they were kind of helping out, but they were not like the public officials. So they're not, at least they are, and they are also the new generation. So, and then because there is such a strong, powerful civil society and many like active citizens, so just like a lot of people, they started to post memes to invent. In Ukraine, we even say that if there is something terrible happening, like there will be in the first in the first 2 hours, Ukrainians will produce like 100 memes already, like to react to any event, and that helps people to cope and to survive also, because Ukrainian history unfortunately has not been a very light path. So people had to cope somehow. People had to survive, and Gauss who really helped, and it's also a way to connect with people in the UK, I think. We both appreciate this kind of humor.
It has to be organic. Like I said, like when the US tried to do it, when the government tried to like commission a meme, it's just one of the worst things you're ever going to see. But the way that they've kind of co-opted the Dark Brandon thing has been really interesting. So I don't know if you...
I don't know Dark Brandon.
So basically, at Republican rallies, they used to chant F Joe Biden. But then a reporter misheard that and said, oh, they seem to be chanting Let's Go Brandon. So the right-wing media started using Let's Go Brandon as like a proxy for F Joe Biden. But that was fine. But then whenever Joe Biden got like a political win, they would start describing that as Dark Brandon. Whenever he was just straight and to the point, they would say, right, oh, Dark Brandon's come out. So now they're selling t-shirts of like Joe Biden with like laser eyes, saying like Dark Brandon and like some of his like to the point tweets and stuff. It's just been a wild journey over the last couple of years of people co-opting and stealing and reappropriating memes to suit their own narrative. But right now, it feels like the White House is winning, but who knows what's going to be in a couple of weeks.
And you kind of have to know the whole story of the meme to understand what's going on.
It's like a seventh tier meme. It's ridiculous. Yeah. It's, oh God, we live in a truly a hellscape.
It has to be organic, and that's why like Russians, when they try to counter, and produce their own memes, they fail because they can't produce a funny piece of content. Like it's coming from top down, and also it's so like it's so high in propaganda. It's so like inflated. It's so artificial, and it's really unclear what they are fighting for. For Ukraine, it's really clear. So that gives people like kind of an additional boost in their creativity, because there is this feeling of like we are fighting for freedom, and like being able to express ourselves freely and use humor is another manifestation of it.
I mean, humor should always punch up rather than down. As soon as humor is punching down, it's not funny. Yeah. Well, with that said, I think it might be time for some wild speculation.
In each episode of The Last Question, we ask our guests to look beyond the scope of their research and speculate wildly about the future. Olga, what do you think the impact of AI will be on the next US and UK general elections?
Yeah, I think we'll see a lot of deep fake videos. We'll see a lot of fake images. We'll see maybe some attempt to hack official websites, and maybe also some media websites to do this. They pretend it's a legitimate media outlet, but in fact, it's not a real one. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think that's what we can expect. But hopefully, there is an awareness also of what is coming, and there are preparations to counter it, and hopefully the AI can also be used to increase transparency and to go after malicious AI. So the good AI goes after the bad AI.
We'd like to thank Olga Tokariuk for joining us today for that fascinating exploration of disinformation. You can see Olga in person at the 2023 edition of Data Summit, the Data Lab's flagship conference right in the middle of DataFest. This year's Data Summit is back at the EICC in Edinburgh on the 2nd and 3rd of November 2023, and you, dear listener, can get an exclusive 25% off in-person and live stream tickets with the code DS23TLQ. That's all caps. So just head over to datafest.global for tickets and information where you can see all of the cool keynotes and panels we're going to have this year. In last week's episode, we spoke to Father Paolo Bonanti, who is the AI advisor to Pope Francis and the Vatican. And the question that we asked our listeners at the end of the episode was, what effect is AI going to have on faith in the future? So we reached out to some religious scholars and leaders from around the world. And over the next couple of episodes, we will explore some of the answers that they gave us. This week, we're going to hear from Dr. Sahasranamam for a Hindu perspective on AI and the future of faith. So this is what he sent to us. Lily, do you want to kick it off?
Quote, a key concept of the Hindu faith is Purushartha, or the four aims of human life, which are Dharma, righteousness, moral values, Artha, prosperity, economic values, Karma, pleasure, psychological values, and Moksha, spiritual values, self-actualization. In the next 50 to 100 years, AI will become a co-pilot for all human endeavors, including decision-making. For maintaining righteousness or Dharma in the world, the algorithm and LLMs, large language models, must be trained on data that is truthful and morally right.
He continued, the advancement in AI will naturally accelerate humanity's attainment of Artha, or economic prosperity, as we are entering a world of abundance with multiple technological convergences. I believe we will also see forms of universal basic income become a norm globally, which will free up a lot of time, which is now spent on day jobs, for humanity to take up other pursuits. This would, in the first instance, be more time spent on pleasure or karma activities. Once individuals exhaust themselves with pleasure and material pursuits, they will begin engaging more in pursuits of meditation and spirituality, which will give them calm and peace. So that was a really, really interesting perspective on the future of faith and AI from a Hindu perspective, which isn't something you see very often in like common sci-fi tropes or even in like big discussions about AI.
It could be in sci-fi in other languages, but just not ones that have been translated to English.
Yeah, I guess I meant just Western sci-fi. Although right now I'm reading a book called Lord of Light, where human colonists go to a distant world and take on the role of gods based on the Hindu Parthenon.
Oh, wow. That sounds really interesting.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting. It's quite dense. It's not, it's not the easiest read in the world. It's taken a while to get to a point, but it's good. George R.R. Martin said it's one of the 5 best sci-fi novels ever written.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
And you're probably learning a lot.
I am. Haven't learned the author's name, but I'm learning other things. So, if you want to hear your thoughts read out on the podcast, please do send them to datafest@thedatalab.com and just answer any of the questions that we ask at the end of the episodes. And there'll be one coming up for this episode in just a second.
And here we are, the last question. This is where we pose our listeners a question, and in a future episode, we'll discuss some of the most interesting answers. Our question this week is, do we live in a post-truth society?
So that's it from us today. We'll be back next time with more insight, innovation, and wild speculation. Feel free to drop us an email to say hello or suggest a topic or make corrections, wherever you like. The best email is datafest@thedatalab.com, or you can find us on Twitter @datalabscotland.
If you enjoyed the podcast, please do leave us a review on your platform of choice. It goes a long way and means a lot to us. Thanks for listening. Join us again next time for another episode of The Last Question. Goodbye.